saying? But other than that, we out here, we live. Big bruh, we out here. We out here. Happy birthday to my pops too. I'll be around there later, pops. We out here. We out here. What we doing? What we doing?
Celebrate.
Can I get a go game from everybody? No go game? Y'all all kicked out my street. Oh, she nasty. That's my wife though. I married her.
She's got one hole to the right temple. Patient is conscious and alert, answers questions appropriately, GCS of 15, actually GCS of 13. She's got one hole to the left or the right temple. She's got one.
What would you do if someone you loved called you, begging for help, and your decision to help them ended up being the worst mistake of your life? Tonight, we're examining a phone call that was supposed to save someone's life, but instead it led to something that will haunt two parents forever. This isn't a story about strangers. This isn't about people you'll never meet or situations you can't relate to. This is about a family, about parents who thought they were doing the right thing, about a daughter who trusted the people she loved most to protect her, and about how sometimes, even when we think we're helping, we can walk straight into a nightmare. The call came on an ordinary Thursday evening. The voice on the other end was panicked, desperate. Someone needed help, needed it right now. And like any loving parents would do, they didn't ask questions. They didn't hesitate. They dropped everything and rushed to help their child. But here's what makes this case so disturbing. The very act of showing up, of being there when their daughter needed them most, put them in a position where they would witness something that would destroy them emotionally for the rest of their lives. They thought they were coming to rescue someone. They had no idea they were about to become victims themselves. What we're going to explore tonight challenges everything we think we know about helping the people we love. It forces us to question whether there are times when getting involved makes things worse. Whether there are situations where even the most well-intentioned actions can lead to tragedy. We often hear about bystanders who don't get involved, who don't help when someone is in trouble. We criticize people who look the other way, but what happens when you do get involved? What happens when you answer that desperate call for help? This case will make you think twice about what it really means to come to someone's aid. The person who made that call was someone who spent their life helping others. Someone who was known for being caring, loving, and kind. Someone who made a difference in other people's lives every single day. But when they needed help themselves, when they reached out to the people they trusted most, everything went wrong in ways no one could have predicted. This story takes place in Florida, in a neighborhood where people knew each other, where families felt safe. The kind of place where you wouldn't expect something like this to happen, where neighbors chat over fences and parents feel comfortable letting their kids play outside. But behind one door, something was building that would shatter not just one family, but an entire community's sense of security. We're going to walk through this case step by step, piece by piece, because the details matter. The timeline matters. The decisions people made matter. And by the end, you'll understand why this particular phone call has become one of the most heartbreaking examples of how quickly everything can go wrong. What makes this case even more complex is that the person who needed help wasn't a stranger to danger. They had been dealing with problems for a while. There had been warning signs, red flags that something wasn't right, but like so many people in difficult situations, they kept hoping things would get better. They kept believing that love could overcome the problems they were facing. The tragedy is that when they finally decided they couldn't handle it alone anymore, when they finally reached out for help, it was already too late. The situation had reached a point where there was no safe way out. No matter what anyone did, someone was going to get hurt. As we dive into this story, we want you to think about the people in your own life, the calls you've made when you were scared, the times people have called you asking for help, because this case will make you realize how quickly a normal evening can turn into something unspeakable. Before we continue, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from tonight. And here's something we're genuinely curious about. Have you ever had to make a desperate phone call asking someone to come help you? Or have you been the person rushing to help someone else in trouble? Sometimes the hardest part about loving someone is knowing when helping them might put everyone at risk. The story we're about to tell you will stay with you long after this video ends, because it's about real people, real decisions, and real consequences that no family should ever have to face. The woman who made that desperate phone call was 34-year-old Shawntai Adkins, and to understand why what happened to her was so devastating, you need to know who she was. Every morning, Shantai would walk through the doors of Florida cancer specialists in Daytona Beach, ready to face one of the most emotionally demanding jobs in healthcare. As a registered nurse, she didn't just administer treatments or check vital signs. She became a lifeline for patients and families navigating some of the darkest moments of their lives. Cancer patients loved her, not just because she was skilled at her job, but because she had this incredible ability to make people feel seen and cared for during their most vulnerable moments. Colleagues would describe her as naturally bubbly, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of worried family members and somehow make everyone feel a little bit better. She had this gift for finding the right words when there weren't any right words to say. But Shantai's caring nature extended far beyond her workplace. She was a devoted mother, the kind of woman who put her children's needs before everything else. Family members would tell you that she had this way of making every person in her life feel like they were the most important person in the world. Whether it was her kids, her parents, or her patients, Shantai gave her whole heart to the people she cared about. Her parents adored her. She wasn't just their daughter, she was their pride and joy, the person who brought energy and warmth into every family gathering. When Shantai was around, there was laughter, there was love, there was this sense that everything was going to be okay, because she had this incredible strength that seemed to lift everyone around her. To the outside world, Shantai appeared to have built a beautiful life. She was married to 35-year-old Shawntai Adkins, and anyone who saw them together would have described their relationship as genuine love. They seemed happy, they seemed connected. Friends and family would watch them interact and think, now that's what real love looks like. Shantai himself was someone who appeared to have his life together. He had worked in education as a school administrator in Volusia County. To neighbors and acquaintances, he came across as a decent guy, the kind of man who would wave hello when he saw you on the street, who seemed friendly and approachable. People in their community viewed him as respectful, someone you could have a normal conversation with. Together, Shantai and Shantai seemed to be building something solid. They had established themselves in Daytona Beach, in a neighborhood where they knew their neighbors and felt part of the community. From all outward appearances, they were a couple who had found their groove, who were working toward shared goals and supporting each other through life's challenges. Shantai was also helping to raise children, taking on the role of mother figure with the same dedication she brought to everything else in her life. She approached parenting the way she approached nursing, with patience, with love, and with an understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be present for someone when they need you. What made Shantai special wasn't just her professional skills or her role as a mother and daughter, it was her fundamental belief in taking care of people. Whether that was a cancer patient who was scared about their diagnosis, a child who needed guidance, or her parents who relied on her emotional support, Shantai showed up. She was reliable. She was steady. She was the kind of person you could count on. This is why the phone call she would make that October evening was so significant. Shantai wasn't someone who asked for help lightly. She was usually the one providing help, the one other people turned to when they needed support. For her to reach out to admit she was in trouble and needed someone to come to her aid meant that something was seriously wrong. The life Shantai had built was centered around love, care, and service to others. She had created a world where she was surrounded by people who valued her, where her work mattered, where she could make a difference. She was living the kind of life that most people would consider successful, meaningful work, loving family relationships, and a marriage that appeared solid from the outside. But as we'll discover, even the most beautiful lives can hide problems that no one sees coming. While Shantai was building her reputation as someone who could heal and comfort others, her husband Shantai was struggling with demons that most people never saw. What the community didn't know about Shawntai Adkins was that his past held some troubling details. Years earlier, he had worked as a corrections officer, a job that requires trust, integrity, and moral character. But in 2010, Shantai was fired from that position for violations of what the department called moral character standards. The specifics of what he did to warrant that dismissal were never made public, but losing a law enforcement job for moral character issues is serious business. It's the kind of thing that follows you, that raises questions about your judgment and reliability. After leaving corrections, Shantai transitioned into education, eventually becoming a school administrator in Volusia County. On paper, it looked like he had turned his life around. He was working with children, contributing to the community, appearing to be a responsible member of society, but the job change couldn't address the deeper issues he was facing. Shantai had developed a serious problem with alcohol. This wasn't occasional social drinking or having a few beers with friends. This was the kind of drinking that interferes with your life, your relationships, and your ability to function normally. The problem had gotten bad enough that he recently had to enter rehabilitation, a major step that suggested his drinking had reached a crisis point. For Shantai, watching the man she loved battle addiction was heartbreaking. She was someone who believed in helping people heal, who had dedicated her professional life to caring for others during their worst moments. When Shantai agreed to go to rehab, she probably felt hopeful that this was the turning point they needed. She likely believed that with treatment, with professional help, they could get their relationship back on track. Shantai stood by Shantai through his treatment. While he was in rehab, she maintained their household, took care of responsibilities, and waited for him to come home sober and ready to rebuild their life together. She was doing what she always did, supporting someone she loved through a difficult time, believing that love and patience could overcome the challenges they were facing. But when Shantai returned from rehabilitation, things didn't improve the way Shantai had hoped they would. In fact, within just a few days of coming home, he did something that showed her his commitment to sobriety might not be as strong as she had believed. Shantai owned a motorcycle that she was particularly proud of. It wasn't just transportation, it was something special to her, something she valued. Just days after Shantai returned from rehab, supposedly clean and committed to his recovery, he took her motorcycle without permission and went for a ride while he was drunk. The betrayal was devastating on multiple levels. First, he had violated her trust by taking something that belonged to her without asking. Second, and more importantly, he had gotten drunk and put himself and other people at risk by driving while intoxicated. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a complete abandonment of everything he was supposed to have learned in treatment. When Shantai confronted Shantai about the motorcycle incident, she made it clear that his behavior was unacceptable. She had supported him through rehab, had believed in his ability to change, and this was how he repaid that faith. The argument that followed was intense, with Shantai expressing her disappointment and frustration with his choices. But even as tensions grew in their marriage, even as Shantai began to question whether Shantai was truly committed to getting better, she continued to hope that things could improve. She wasn't ready to give up on their relationship, wasn't ready to admit that the man she had married might not be capable of the changes she needed him to make. To neighbors and friends, the problems in the Adkins marriage weren't obvious. Shantai still appeared to be the same friendly, approachable guy they had always known. Shantai, being the private person she was, didn't share the full extent of what was happening at home. From the outside, they still looked like a couple working through normal relationship challenges. But inside their house on Fulton Street, the tension was building. Shantai was starting to realize that love and support might not be enough to save her marriage. October 19th, 2023 started like any other Thursday for Shantai. She got up prepared for another day of caring for cancer patients and went to work at Florida Cancer Specialists. She had no way of knowing that before the day was over, her entire world would collapse. The discovery that would destroy her marriage came from an unexpected source: Shantai's Apple Watch. Technology has a way of revealing secrets that people think they can keep hidden, and on this particular day, Shantai's watch betrayed him in the worst possible way. Messages started popping up on the watch screen, messages that weren't meant for Shantai to see. As she looked at the notifications, she realized she was reading conversations between her husband and another woman. These weren't innocent texts between friends. These were intimate messages that made it crystal clear that Shantai was having an affair. The betrayal hit Shantai like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had stood by her husband through his alcohol addiction, who had waited for him during his time in rehab, who had forgiven him for taking her motorcycle while drunk just days after returning from treatment. She had been patient, supportive, and hopeful that their marriage could survive his struggles with sobriety. And now she was discovering that while she was being the loyal, supportive wife, Shantai was sharing intimate moments with someone else. The infidelity wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage vows, it was a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed to help him get better. As Shantai read through the messages, the full scope of Shantai's deception became clear. This wasn't a one-time mistake or a moment of weakness. This was an ongoing relationship, something that had been happening while she was working long shifts at the hospital, while she was caring for cancer patients, while she was believing in his recovery and their future together. The emotional devastation was overwhelming. Shantai wasn't just hurt, she was done, completely, irrevocably done with trying to save a marriage to a man who clearly had no respect for her or their relationship. All the patience she had shown, all the second chances she had given, all the hope she had maintained, none of it mattered because Shantai had been lying to her face while carrying on with another woman. In her anger and heartbreak, Shantai called her mother. The conversation was emotional and definitive. She told her mom that she had discovered Shantai's affair, that she couldn't take any more of his behavior, and that she was planning to file for divorce that very day. This wasn't a threat or an ultimatum. This was a woman who had reached her breaking point and was ready to take action. Her mother could hear the pain and determination in Shantai's voice. This wasn't the first time they had talked about problems in her marriage, but this time was different. This time, Shantai wasn't asking for advice or looking for ways to work things out. She had made her decision, and she was moving forward with it. When Shantai came home that evening, Shantai was ready for him. She confronted him about the messages she had seen, about the affair he had been hiding, about the lies he had been telling while she was trying to save their marriage. The argument that followed was intense and heated, fueled by months of accumulated resentment and this final, unforgivable betrayal. Shantai found himself backed into a corner. His secret was out, his wife was leaving him, and there was no way to talk his way out of what he had done. The evidence was right there on his own watch, undeniable proof of his infidelity. For a man who appeared to have control issues, who had struggled with moral character problems in his past, the prospect of losing his wife, especially to his own actions, was apparently unbearable. By 6:30 p.m., the argument had escalated to a level that frightened Shantai. This wasn't just yelling or harsh words. Something in Shantai's demeanor, something in his tone or his behavior, made her realize that she was no longer safe in her own home. The man she had married, the man she had tried to help through his addiction, was becoming someone she didn't recognize. That's when Shantai made the phone call we talked about at the beginning, the desperate call to her parents asking them to come help her. She wasn't calling to ask them to mediate the argument or to help them work through their problems. She was calling because she was scared and needed backup to get out safely. Her parents didn't ask questions. They heard the fear in their daughter's voice and immediately got in their car to drive to the house on Fulton Street. They were probably thinking they would arrive, help calm Shantai down, and take Shawntai somewhere safe until he cooled off. They were probably expecting a tense but manageable domestic situation. They had no idea they were driving towards something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As Shantai's parents rushed across town to help their daughter, Shantai was facing the reality that his marriage was over and his wife was leaving him. For some people, that realization leads to acceptance, to working on becoming a better person. But for Shawntai Adkins, it would lead to a decision that would destroy multiple lives in a matter of minutes. What do you think Shantai should have done differently? Should she have confronted Shantai about the affair at all? Or should she have just quietly left? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're invested in this story and want to see how it ends, go ahead and hit that like button. When Shantai's parents pulled up to the house on Fulton Street, everything looked deceptively normal from the outside. It was a quiet residential block, the kind of neighborhood where people felt safe walking their dogs in the evening. Nothing about the scene suggested they were about to walk into a life-altering tragedy. But as soon as they approached the front door, they could hear the argument still raging inside. Voices were raised, tension was thick, and it was immediately clear that the situation between their daughter and son-in-law hadn't cooled down during the time it took them to drive over. When they entered the house, they found Shawntai ready to leave. She had made her decision. She was getting out of this marriage, getting out of this house, and she wanted her parents to help her do it safely. The conversation with Shawntai was over. There was nothing left to discuss, nothing left to work out. She just needed to get away from him. Her parents immediately positioned themselves as a buffer between Shantai and Shantai. They could see that emotions were running high, and their primary concern was de-escalating the situation long enough to get their daughter out of there. This wasn't about taking sides or getting involved in the details of their marital problems. This was about making sure everyone stayed safe. As they began moving toward the front door with Shantai, Shantai's behavior became increasingly agitated. The reality that his wife was actually leaving, that her parents were helping her leave, seemed to trigger something in him. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was his wife walking out of his life, and he wasn't handling it well. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but those seconds would replay in her parents' minds for the rest of their lives. As Shantai stepped toward the threshold of the front door, literally stepping toward freedom and safety, Shantai made a choice that transformed him from an angry husband into a killer. He moved away from the group and grabbed a rifle that was kept in the house. The sight of Shantai with a weapon changed everything instantly. What had been a tense domestic situation suddenly became a life-or-death emergency. Shantai's parents realized they weren't just dealing with an upset man anymore. They were dealing with someone who was armed and clearly not thinking rationally. Shantai was still moving toward the door when Shantai raised the rifle. She was so close to getting out safely, so close to starting the new life she had decided she wanted. In that moment, she probably thought she was going to make it. She probably thought the worst part was behind her. But Shantai pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Shantai in the back of the neck as she was stepping through the doorway. The woman who had spent her career healing others, who had dedicated her life to caring for people in their most vulnerable moments, was shot down by the very person who was supposed to love and protect her. Shantai collapsed near the threshold of her home, mortally wounded. The front door that should have been her pathway to safety became the place where her life ended. Her parents watched in absolute horror as their daughter, the woman they had rushed over to help, was shot down right in front of them. The chaos that followed was beyond anything they could have prepared for. Shantai's father, realizing that Shantai was still armed and still dangerous, tried to flee for his own life. In his desperation to get away from the gunfire, he injured himself badly, breaking his leg as he scrambled to escape what had become a war zone. But Shantai wasn't finished. With Shantai dying on the floor and her father trying to escape, Shantai turned the rifle toward both of her parents. The man who had just murdered his wife was now threatening to kill her parents as well, the very people who had come to help defuse the situation. In those terrifying moments, Shantai's mother found herself staring down the barrel of a gun held by a man who had just proven he was capable of killing someone he claimed to love. The son-in-law she had known for years, the man she had welcomed into their family, was pointing a weapon at her and threatening to take her life too. Whether it was the realization of what he had done, or some other thought process entirely, Shantai then made another devastating choice. He turned the rifle on himself and pulled the trigger, shooting himself in the chest. The self-inflicted gunshot wound was serious but not fatal. He collapsed in the front yard, wounded but still alive. Within minutes, the quiet residential block was transformed into a crime scene. A neighbor who heard the gunshots came outside to investigate and found Shantai's mother in the street, frantically waving her arms and trying to get help. By incredible timing, a Daytona Beach police officer was in the area and quickly responded to the scene. First responders arrived to find a scene of absolute devastation. Shantai lay dead near her front door, just steps away from the freedom she had been trying to reach. Shantai was bleeding in the front yard from his self-inflicted wound. Her father was injured from his desperate attempt to escape, and her mother was in shock from witnessing her daughter's murder. The house that should have been a home had become the site of an execution. The parents who had rushed over to help their daughter in a domestic dispute had instead become witnesses to her murder. The evening that started with a phone call asking for help had ended with a family completely destroyed. As paramedics worked to save Shantai's life and police secured the scene, one fact was undeniable. Shawntai Adkins, the caring nurse who had dedicated her life to healing others, was dead at age 34, killed by the very person who had promised to love her. Unlike many murder cases that drag on for years with complex investigations and lengthy manhunts, the case against Shawntai Adkins was essentially solved the moment police arrived at the scene. There was no mystery about who pulled the trigger, no question about what had happened, and no doubt about the motive. Shantai was rushed to the hospital under police guard, where doctors worked to save his life from the self-inflicted gunshot wound to his chest. While he was recovering, investigators began the methodical process of building an airtight case that would ensure he faced the full consequences of his actions. The most powerful evidence came from the two people who had witnessed the entire tragedy unfold: Shantai's parents. Despite their trauma, despite having just watched their daughter die in front of them, they provided investigators with detailed accounts of exactly what they had seen. Their testimony would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Detectives also recovered the digital evidence that had started the deadly chain of events. The Apple Watch messages that revealed Shantai's affair were preserved, providing clear documentation of the motive that had driven him to murder his wife. The timeline was perfectly clear: discovery of infidelity, confrontation, escalation, and ultimately execution. Physical evidence from the scene supported every detail of the parents' account. The rifle was recovered, ballistics confirmed it was the murder weapon, and the positioning of evidence matched exactly what the eyewitnesses had described. Even Shantai's own gunshot wound served as evidence, proving he had been at the scene with the weapon. Once Shantai was medically cleared, he was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder, along with 2 counts of aggravated assault for threatening Shantai's parents with the rifle. He was held without bond in the Volusia County Jail while prosecutors prepared their case. The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed for a murder case. By June 2025, Shawntai Adkins found himself sitting in a Volusia County courtroom, facing a jury of his peers who would decide his fate. The trial itself was remarkably brief, lasting only 2 days because the evidence was so overwhelming that there was little to contest. Prosecutors methodically presented their case, walking the jury through the events of that October evening. They played recordings of Shantai's final phone call to her parents. They presented the digital evidence of the affair. Most powerfully, they put Shantai's parents on the witness stand to describe what they had seen with their own eyes. The defense had virtually nothing to work with. Their client had been caught at the scene, wounded by his own hand, with the murder weapon nearby and multiple eyewitnesses to his crime. There was no arguing self-defense, no claiming it was an accident, no suggesting someone else was responsible. When the jury retired to deliberate on Shantai's guilt or innocence, court observers expected they might be out for hours discussing the details of the case. Instead, they returned in exactly 17 minutes with their verdict guilty on all counts. 17 minutes. In less time than it takes most people to decide what to watch on television, 12 jurors had unanimously agreed that Shawntai Adkins was guilty of executing his wife in front of her parents. The speed of their decision sent a clear message about how they viewed both the evidence and the defendant. Under Florida law, a first-degree murder conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. When Shantai returned to court for sentencing on June 23, 2025, the judge imposed that life sentence plus an additional 10 years for the aggravated assault charges against Shantai's parents. The message was clear: Shawntai Adkins would never walk free again. State Attorney R.J. Larissa spoke passionately about the case during sentencing, calling it every parent's worst nightmare and emphasizing how Shantai had executed our victim in front of her parents and then threatened to do the same to them. His words captured the pure evil of what had occurred that October evening. But while justice was served in the courtroom, the real work of honoring Shantai's memory was happening in the community she had served. Online memorial pages filled with tributes from patients whose lives she had touched, colleagues who had worked alongside her, and strangers who were moved by her story. Hundreds of virtual candles were lit in her memory, each one representing someone who wanted to ensure that Shawntai Adkins would not be forgotten. Comments poured in from people sharing their own experiences with domestic violence, with many crediting Shantai's story as giving them the courage to seek help or leave dangerous relationships. Local domestic violence organizations began using Shantai's case as an example of how quickly situations can turn deadly, emphasizing the importance of safety planning and recognizing warning signs before it's too late. Her death became a catalyst for conversations about supporting people in abusive relationships and the critical need for intervention resources. Most importantly, Shantai is remembered not as a victim, but as the healer she always was. Her children will grow up knowing that their mother dedicated her life to caring for others, that she brought light into dark places, and that she was loved by everyone who knew her. Today, Shawntai Adkins sits in a Florida prison cell where he will remain for the rest of his life, while Shantai's family continues the difficult work of healing from an unimaginable loss. But her legacy, the lives she saved, the patients she comforted, the love she shared, continues to make a difference in the world. Before we go, we want to know what's one word that describes how this story made you feel. Drop it in the comments below. And if this case has taught you anything about recognizing the signs of domestic violence or supporting someone in a dangerous relationship, please share this video with someone who might need to see it. Make sure you're subscribed for more true crime cases that matter, and remember, sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply listen when someone calls asking for help.